All right, looks like we're recording. This is Tom for the Ketogenic Fasting Project. Today we got a guest named Zach Bitter. Zach's known for ultra marathoning, and he was kind enough to come on and have a nice discussion. I think we're going to start out talking about focusing on lifestyle changes. So, how you doing today, Zach?
Good, Tom. Thanks for having me on the show.
I'm glad you're here. So, tell everybody a little bit about what you do and what shapes your lifestyle.
Yeah, so I guess the easiest way to describe my lifestyle is extreme endurance, and I think sometimes when people hear that, their mind immediately goes to kind of the end product, and they kind of assume that that's like every day. So they'll see, oh, well, Zach ran a 100-mile race. He must be running like 100 miles regularly, and that's maybe a little bit of an embellishment. I mean, I definitely train a lot of running. When I'm peak training, I'll get up towards 20 hours a week worth of training and stuff like that in preparation for these type of events. But there's very much kind of a periodization where, there's times a year where I'm at a much lower rate of training, and there's times a year where it's a lot higher. And I'm kind of always making that balance between optimizing for a specific race versus recovering and getting ready for the next one. And I guess holistically, kind of the trajectory into the sport, I kind of like to share, because sometimes I think it can be hard to remember or just really connect the dots as to like how long of a process it can be if you want to, I guess, do it in a way that I would call sustainable. So, I was in cross country, track and field in like high school and college. And after college, I started kind of getting into more of the methodologies of training and some of the different like approaches to endurance events. And one thing I learned through my experience running in college was that my favorite workout of the week was the long run. So I think if there was a sign at that point that I was going to end up becoming an extreme endurance athlete, that was probably it. So after college, I kind of jumped into a 50-mile race back in 2010 and had a really good experience with it. So it was kind of on the back of my mind for about another year there. And then at the end of 2011, I started what I would consider kind of a holistic training approach towards extreme endurance, and kind of focusing all my energies on peaking for those type of events versus some of the more standard traditional distances.
Wow. So 50 miler was what got you convinced that was for you, huh?
Yeah, it's actually kind of funny. I remember real distinctly. I had a couple of my college buddies out there helping me out that day, and it was this race that, now when I look back on it, it's a trail event, but it's a very runnable, like relatively flat trail for the most part. And living in the Midwest most of my life, I was very familiar with flat running and not super familiar with anything steep. And I remember distinctly coming around like mile 42, 43 was probably the first time during that event where I felt like a bit of a low spot. And we went around this turn, me and my buddy, and he was kind of like looking out ahead, and I was kind of had my head down, and he saw this like climb at like mile 43, and he's just like, oh no, Zach's not going to be happy to see that. I remember coming around that thinking like, why did the RD put this hill there? And in hindsight, after going through races where there's much steeper, more technical stuff than that, it's kind of funny to look back on the perception or the way you see those things kind of in the early days.
Mm. So you think that most people kind of come to it like you do, that they realize that you realize you like that really long workout, and then you tried something longer, and then you think that's how most people get into ultra marathoning?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think I think historically people found themselves kind of ending up in ultra marathons for a variety of different reasons, and it wasn't a sport that was necessarily targeted by kind of the younger group of folks that had a more traditional build into endurance sports. It kind of, in North America anyway, the trail side of things seemed to kind of grow as more of a just, a community that wanted to be outdoors, wanted to kind of test their limits and try things and kind of be out on the trails in the mountains and things like that. And it's really kind of evolved. There's certainly that kind of aspect to it still today. And there's a strong segment of those folks who are in it for that sort of a purpose. But then there's also like kind of a group of guys and gals who are very much kind of high level collegiate athletes, moving into the sport with the mindset of really structuring their training and their approach and trying to find specific races to really peak at. And they still, I think, do a really good job of understanding where the community roots are and kind of working within those parameters and keeping things, kind of, I guess, chill. But there's maybe a little bit more of a competitive mind on the race course as well, which I think adds an interesting and unique dynamic as the sport gets more popular and a little more competitive. But yeah, you see folks coming in for all sorts of reasons. I've talked to folks who are interested in doing an ultra endurance event who've never really done traditional endurance events. And then I've seen folks who've kind of exhausted themselves in that world and then decide, okay, I'm going to try this. It's something different, something new, something maybe fresh mentally in just a different training plan. And that kind of draws them in. And I think it's just really that information is from the coaching side, especially, is useful to know just in terms of like what type of an approach is maybe sustainable in preparation versus what would maybe end up kind of fizzling out over time. And I think there's quite a bit of a variance between someone who's had like a lifetime of endurance activities versus someone who decided to, start doing ultra marathons later in life with not a base of endurance sport in their life prior.
It's interesting. I didn't expect the community aspect of people wanting to do outdoor activities as being sort of a cornerstone of it, because it kind of resonates with me because I've been working with other people trying to build community around autistic people, supporting both high functioning adults who interact online as well as family members and clinicians and doctors and stuff like that. Is kind of at the base of these videos, as well as the online groups, particularly Facebook groups and stuff that I'm involved in. So that's kind of a crossover.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the community aspect is something that is like really cool to look at, because I think like the unique thing about like ultra marathons is that, and I think this is what people find out when they do their first one or they're at one for the first time and end up kind of jumping in, is what they recognize is like it's very unique compared to maybe a traditional sport where, if I turn on the TV and I watch an NFL football game or an NBA basketball game, hockey, baseball, any of those type of sports, it's like it's very difficult to really, I think, compare or relate to some of those figures. Just because they're kind of so far out and above and doing things that are maybe like unapproachable to me, versus a 100-mile ultra endurance event where the community is kind of more like involved, I guess, in the act itself. Like, I could sign up for a super competitive 100-miler, and then, there's going to be a person who gets first and there's going to be a person who gets last. But it seems like everyone in the front and in the back and everywhere in between are very much aware and appreciative of how hard of a task that is and really respects it. So you oftentimes see like just as much fanfare at the end of a race as someone's finishing right before the cutoff, one of the very final finishers, as you do the first person across the line. And I think that's pretty unique in a sport context where like everyone is kind of celebrated to a degree. And I think that's really a big draw for folks to come into a community that's as welcoming as that.
That is interesting. Yeah, I could kind of see that. I mean, it's quite a contrast to, like you said, like other sports, where everybody's sort of involved and everybody's sort of rooting for everybody no matter where they finish. Yeah, it's quite an accomplishment. It's hard for, I'm sure, a lot of people like myself to imagine running 100+ miles. Yeah, that's one of the things I wanted to ask you about was when you start getting into the sport and you start running fast, farther and farther, does the whole lifestyle change kind of come behind that, where you're just looking for greater performance, and then you start looking deeper into diet and maybe sleep and training technique? Is it kind of?
I mean, that's how it was for me. I think there's definitely folks who, are more willing to neglect that or ignore it as long as they can. For me, it was always kind of like, historically in endurance sports, I was always a decent endurance athlete. I competed in college. I was at the state cross country and track meet as a senior in high school. So I had some talent and some ability to kind of, manifest that. But I was never to a point where I would consider myself kind of right at the top of that stuff. Like I wasn't winning state cross country meets or podiuming or doing that in track and field either. And then in college, I went to a very good Division III program, but I certainly wasn't like top on the team or anything like that. So my kind of mindset was like maybe a little different than had I had a different experience with some of the more traditional events. So for me, I always looked at things like making sure I got as good a sleep as possible, made sure my diet was on point, at least to what I believed was on point. And, the training was as good as I could get and things like that. I just paid pretty close attention to that stuff because in my mind, I thought like I'm going to have to be more on top of some of these controllable variables that maybe everyone else isn't necessarily paying as close attention to, that on paper would probably beat me if they had all their ducks in a row, so to speak. So that was always kind of fascinating to me that there was other ways, like through nutrition, through sleep, through, proper training and things like that, that it could, take me potentially to another level that I wouldn't maybe be able to get to if I just ignored things like nutrition and sleep and recovery and all that stuff. So, my story specifically was, I think, in the early stages, I think made a whole lot of sense to most people where, you look at most endurance, like nutrition protocols, and you're going to find a lot of information on kind of how carbohydrates are king. And that's like the gold standard for endurance athletes. And you need to be targeting things like 60 to 70% of your intake coming from carbohydrate. And then like the next level of that is finding the quality sources. It's not just about eating a bunch of junk carbohydrates, but getting your, quote unquote, healthy whole grains, your fruits, your vegetables, and that sort of thing. So, I mean, in college, I started to kind of think more about that stuff, and I started to skew my nutrition to what I would consider a very clean, high carbohydrate diet from a more traditional endurance nutritional program. And, that was what worked fine for me, it seemed, until I started really diving into making ultra marathons a primary focus of my lifestyle. And, what I noticed is I was turning in my mid-20s, I was turning into someone who historically had been a very good sleeper. I usually didn't have to worry about uncontrollables when it came to sleep. If I just held myself accountable and got to bed at the right time, I would get 8 to 9 hours of uninterrupted sleep, no problem. But then, when I got to my mid-20s and was kind of well along my way into focusing primarily on ultra marathons, I started noticing that was not the case any longer. Like all of a sudden, like I could go to bed on time and not get enough sleep because I might wake up 3 or 4 times to go to the bathroom or just take 20, 30 minutes to fall back asleep. Things that just weren't normal for me and that I sensed were not normal in terms of someone who is living a healthy, sustainable lifestyle. Other things were just like, bigger energy swings throughout the course of the day. It was kind of harder just to like charge hard all day long. And then at the end of the day, go to bed. It was like, I might be able to charge hard for parts of the day, but then that might be met with a big dip in energy where I could almost sit down and take a nap at any point. And, things like that were kind of red flags to me. Like I need to address something. These aren't normal things for a healthy male in their mid-20s to be having happen to them. So my mindset was perhaps a bit stubborn, where like I didn't want to regress or step back from the training and racing side of things, because I really did enjoy those activities and that process. So I didn't want to, cut back on that as like a way to maybe reverse some of those red flags I was noticing. So kind of along that same timeline, I had started listening to podcasts a lot more while I would do runs. And I started gravitating towards kind of sports nutritional podcasts. And I came across a few that were talking about kind of a high fat, low carb diet and some of the benefits of it or potential benefits. And, that led to getting me connected with guys like Dr. Volek and Dr. Finney, as well as many other people who had kind of had a little more experience in that realm. And at the end of 2011, I started to implement that approach. And, I had a healthy amount of skepticism as to whether it would work or not. I really had no clue. I thought like at the time, like this could go great. It could go horrible. It could be no different. And there's really only one way to find out. And so I kind of dove into it, and, I noticed a lot of those non-running related kind of tertiary things started to improve like pretty quickly. Like within a couple of weeks, I was sleeping a lot more uninterrupted, like consistently through the night again. My energy levels doing non-running related activities were very consistent. I didn't feel like I had that roller coaster of high energy, low energy, just doing, going to work and things like that. And then after about a month or so, I started noticing that kind of my base level or lower end, kind of more aerobic paced runs started to, come back to where they were before. And with all those added benefits with the other stuff too. And then it just became kind of a bit of a puzzle to solve as to how do I work this specific approach to nutrition within the variety of different lifestyle components in my specific life. And, that's where it gets maybe a little tricky for people to wrap their heads around to a degree, because, I think most people, if they look at all the days in the year, there's a lot of consistency in terms of like how much energy they're expending. Whereas for me, it can be quite different. The way I describe it is, if you pick a day out of a hat of a calendar year, for me, you might pick a day where I'm running a 100-mile race in which my resting metabolic rate, I'm burning like, 4, 5, 6 times my resting metabolic rate during that event. And then but you could also pick a day out where it's after that, or 2 days after that, where I'm doing very little and I'm probably just burning my resting metabolic rate. So like the way you kind of look at intake from a macronutrient side of things, I think is different depending on kind of where I am in that training phase. And those are kind of the two extreme ends of it. There's everything in between as well. So finding an approach that kind of works with that ever changing or that frequently changing lifestyle, I think is an interesting thing for me. And it's been one of the puzzles I've tried to solve, or found that just takes a lot of attention, and it's been fun for me to do for myself, as well as help others kind of find their path within that type of framework.
Yeah, let me ask you a little bit about getting sleep. I've spent a lot of time working on my sleep as well, and I know I personally, I wear earplugs, blindfold, get the room as cold as possible. I got blackout curtains. Is that anything will wake me up? And it wasn't until I started using electronic monitors that I really realized they really kept me honest, because I started realizing how much time I wasn't asleep, even if I was in bed, and there was a direct correlation to how I felt and cognitive function. So I started implementing all these things. I know I read the book, The Sleep Solution. It had a lot of good tips in it. So what type of things did you do to improve your sleep quality?
Yeah. So, I mean, really the only thing I did back when I switched my diet was switching the diet. Like I tried to actually keep as much constant during that change as possible, so that I could be more confident about that being the driving force behind any changes that occurred. And one thing I was trying to avoid would be like, okay, I'll change this nutrition thing, but if I also introduce a whole bunch of other potential beneficial tactics to sleep hygiene, I could potentially identify the diet as being a contributor that it wasn't, or at least not to the level that it was. So for a while there, I didn't really do anything differently than what I had been in the past, other than switching up the nutrition. And that cleaned things up to such a good degree. I've just never really found that I needed to do a whole lot of additional stuff to kind of, clean up the sleep hygiene situation to a massive degree. I mean, I'm definitely aware of some of these other things that I think are very valuable, like you mentioned, like the blackout curtains. I mean, you don't have to really try too hard to like recognize how much of a difference that can make, especially if you're trying to sleep past the sunrise. And one thing I do notice is like my circadian rhythm follows the sunrise and sunset pretty closely. I'll start to like feel like my energy levels are starting to down regulate as soon as the sun starts to set. And if I have the curtains open and the sun rises, like usually I'm a lot more inclined to kind of pop out of bed when that starts to happen, versus if I close those, if I have like the blackout curtains on, I can sleep, well into sunrise, and beyond if I'm tired enough and I was up late enough the night before. So I think those sort of things are great. I'll put on like headphones too, just to more or less normalize the quietness, because I do travel quite a bit. So like you can imagine, I could control my household noise level pretty easily. The hard part is to mimic that when you're not at your house. So, one way I've done that would be just because if you're wearing some sort of like earplug or noise canceling like device or something like that, then you can just kind of standardize the level of quietness or lack of noise across like a lot of different environments, even if one environment is louder or different than another one.
Yeah, on the sleep thing, I noticed when I went low carb and then keto and then carnivore, I slept a lot deeper, but I also made a transition from being kind of a night owl to really sort of being in sync with the sun, and I couldn't sleep in anymore. So I had to really like sort of light proof everything. And even then still, I couldn't really sleep much after the sun came up. And if I woke up, there was no going back to sleep. So it's interesting because the quality of sleep for me got better, but there was no escaping sort of a circadian rhythm that was synced with the sun. So
yeah. Did you find that switching the diet for you almost aligned you with like what you would maybe consider a more traditional circadian rhythm?
certainly seemed to. That's the only explanation I have. So yeah, I assume that's correct.
Yeah, because I mean, I feel like that was the first time I ever noticed it. Even like, I mean, maybe it was
Right.
just like ignorance of youth, where like, when I was 25, like there was a good chunk of my life where I paid very little attention to that sort of thing, and it was like,
Right.
especially when you're younger, like in high school and college, sometimes you get into a mindset of just like, well, I'll stay up as late as I want, or I'll stay up as late as there's something entertaining happening, and then I'll go to bed when that stops, and then
Right.
that kind of I never, I guess maybe I just didn't give it a whole lot of thought, but it is something I did notice where it seemed like instead of me I had a harder, I guess the best way to describe it is I have a harder time kind of fighting the proper circadian rhythm. Whereas in the past I could kind of probably to my own detriment, I'm sure, blast right through it sometimes. And now it's like, your body does a pretty good job of saying, hey, don't be an idiot, go to bed at the right time.
Right. Yeah, no, it's like you start to suffer if you don't get enough sleep. And part of that too, of course, might be age. You can get
Mm-hmm.
away with more when you're younger. But yeah, no, I really didn't have much awareness of anything that's synchronized with the sun. It seemed like I could sleep any time of day, but particularly I could stay up late doing stuff and then sleep in the morning. It didn't matter. Now can't really get away with that. So let's see, what was the next one here? One of the questions I always have is, when people are doing these long endurance races, where does the mindset come from? Is it something that you would sort of frame as mental toughness?
Yeah, I think I think it almost is more mental stamina when you get into the ultra marathon world, and it's maybe more mental toughness when we're talking about some of the more shorter endurance events. And the reason I say that is because it seems like with 100 miles or something like around that type of a distance, what ends up happening is it's less about not being tough enough at the end as much as it just becomes like fatigue. Like you can't mentally kind of convince yourself that you should be able to do a certain pacing, even though the relative effort is very low compared to what you're capable of on any given day. Whereas like, say if I were to go race a 5 kilometer, there's a certain amount of just like kind of, I think, big like mental barriers to push through from just can I even run this fast kind of a mindset. And you have to kind of convince yourself and be strong-willed in that, where like maybe if everyone says, no, you can't run X minute per mile for 5 kilometers, you saying, okay, well, my training is indicative that I can, and I feel I can. And then that I think is more in line with a mental toughness versus, 80 miles into a 100-mile thinking, do I still have the mental stamina to convince myself I can manage the pace I planned versus, letting all that like doubt seep in and then just kind of cave to it. And, it's really interesting, I think, because when you get to like the mental stamina side of things, I think it's, there's always little seeds of doubt that pop up through the course of a race, but early in the race, when your mind is fresh enough, it gets really easy to kind of like slap those self-doubts down. And then they don't necessarily pop up as frequently. You get to the end of it, and they're popping up very frequently, and it gets harder and harder to kind of suppress them. So I'm convinced that's what makes, like, say, a 10-minute stretch in the beginning of a race feel like it goes by so fast versus a 10-minute stretch at the back end of a race feel like it's dragging on and on forever.
Did you find that the change in diet and going to a higher fat diet had any impact on your mental process?
Yeah, I think, I think if anything, the way I would describe it is like you kind of have this more calm sense of energy throughout, where versus like this big, like almost burst of anxiety and adrenaline, which can oftentimes be met with a dip in that. And you're always kind of chasing that high, so to speak. When I was higher carb or high carb, I felt like I was always kind of chasing that high feeling that you get when you like would pound a bunch of carbohydrates or sports drinks, at the level that you would need to if you're very dependent on carbohydrates. And then it was just, you just knew like it's a matter of time before this wears off. And then I'm going to have to try to do that again. And then you're kind of you're playing this game of Russian roulette with your digestive system, where like, how often can you do that before, things go south? And some folks are better at that than others. I mean, I know folks in the ultra marathon community that follow high carb diets, and they can just pound carbohydrates all day long for 100 miles, and they seem to be able to kind of run that system. And then there's people on the other end of that spectrum where, if they're taking in even a low amount of carbohydrates, their stomach goes on them, and then eventually that affects their performance drastically. And I don't think I wasn't on either end of that spectrum. I was probably somewhere in the middle. But for me, it still made a lot of logistical sense where, the intensity at a 100-mile race is very low compared to most endurance races. So the utilization of fat as a fuel source as a primary fuel source is just made a lot of sense to me. And then in 100 miles, there's still a lot of the common variables of running involved in a race like that, but there's also other logistics, and some of these events tend to kind of have a flair for extremes, in that it's not enough just to be an extreme distance. It also has to be extreme weather or extreme terrain. So like, when you have those variables thrown in, all of a sudden you have to be on top of a lot of other things like hydration, electrolytes, nutrition, and there's just a lot of logistics to juggle. So for me, it was like, however I can minimize the number of these logistics I have to juggle, the better I'm going to have from a mental approach to it. Because I think sometimes, like with ultra endurance, people think, okay, I need to be prepared. And in the efforts of becoming prepared, they find themselves working themselves up into an anxious state because they're just thinking about, well, I need this and I need that. And at this point I have to get this. And before they know it, they've exhausted themselves mentally before the race even began. So for me to try to eliminate that so I can kind of stay calm and have that kind of calm sense of energy, part of that was just making the logistics easier. And I think part of it too is just having like a well enough fat adapted approach for you as an individual so that you can kind of rely on that fuel source as a primary fueling source. And that's just going to be a little more steady at those energy levels, in my opinion.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. I'm always thinking of it in terms of people who are just trying to make a change for the first time, and it makes a lot of sense to take some variables out of it so that they can, things are simpler from the get-go, and there's just less to worry about, fewer calculations to make as well. That's one of the things that kind of had me baffled for a long time, because I went low carb keto in early 2017. I dropped a bunch of weight. It felt a lot better. I had arthritis really bad. That went away. And then I went carnivore at the end of 2017, and my weight remained stable. And I was constantly trying a new calculator, trying to figure out, you know, how much I should be eating to start getting leaner, which has always been the biggest issue. And it wasn't until I contacted the folks at Paleo Medicina, because I still had psoriasis as well, and it wasn't going away. And they're pretty adept at dealing with autoimmune diseases. And they, if I went to like Keto Gains or Fitbit or Chronograph or one of those, it was telling me to eat like, so I was telling me I was burning somewhere between 4,000 and 5,000 calories a day, especially when I was working out. But they had me go all the way down to closer to about 2,300 calories. It wasn't until then, till I started losing. Otherwise, I was weight stable. And you think I was a difference of like 2,000 calories a day, and I was just hover right there. And so obviously, if you cut an extra 2,000 calories by 10%, there was no difference. 20%, there was no difference. Mm-hmm. So I was wondering, because I was so far outside, probably because of all the dieting in the past when metabolism was probably suppressed or whatever. I'm always wondering, as like people who haven't had any practice at dieting, how do they even get started with trying to figure out how much to take in? I imagine you deal with a lot of athletes that have a lot of experience, you know, so they have some idea where they're at. But how do you think in general people just even get started with the basics like that?
Yeah, I think to a degree, you kind of have to meet people where they're at. Some folks I think would be way more receptive to hitting the reset button, like in a what would be considered a more drastic way. So like going full carnivore, even if it's as just like a hard reset where you're going to do it for 30 days and try to get all your baseline back to normal, and then start kind of playing around with what you can tolerate or can't tolerate, versus a person who maybe would need, or would maybe need to be like to inch into it. And I think those are kind of the two types of people that kind of surface the most. The person who wants to like, well, let's make a minor change and kind of assess, and then make another minor change, and then ultimately we'll get to where I want to be, versus the person who's like kind of more or less fed up because they've been told so many different things that didn't work for them for one reason or the other, or maybe they were given an approach that in theory or on paper could work, but when they tried to implement it in their own lifestyle or in their own personal context, it just wasn't a sustainable approach for them. It wasn't something they were going to be able to stick to, or for whatever reason. So I think sometimes you have to kind of like dig into the background or where the motives are for the person, and then kind of work from there. And sometimes you have to maybe try a few different ways before you find a good starting point for some folks. And, for me personally, since like my background isn't in nutrition, I'm not a dietitian or a doctor or anything like that. I rarely kind of put that on a person as like, oh, if you want to, come to me for help from an endurance training standpoint, you have to adopt this like high fat, low carb diet or this keto approach or, anything else. I like to help people when they're genuinely interested, because I think about my own entry to it, and it was like, if I hadn't been interested in it or curious about it, the likelihood of me doing it right or being motivated to even do it in the first place would have been probably quite low. But I was very curious, and I was interested to kind of see what would happen, and what potential gains or lack thereof would occur from that type of a dietary change. So I think that curiosity and that open-mindedness is really important. And if the person has that, they're going to be able, once we identify kind of what approach is going to work best for them as a starting point, they're going to probably stick to it and be motivated to kind of find out if it is a good approach for them or not.
Yeah, I think curiosity was my big driver too. Maybe that's the key, is just, if people are interested and want to succeed, maybe it's just about helping them develop their curiosity.
Mm-hmm.
That's what will carry them through.
Yeah, because I think sometimes people don't even really recognize why they're doing what they're doing. I think if specifically in the world that I deal with the most, it's there's a lot of sports science out there that will point to carbohydrates as being a higher performance food group, and I think I'm nowhere near a point where I would say throw all that out the window. But I do think there's a healthy amount of misunderstanding in that, like, it seems like a lot of times people are willing to look at kind of, well, what are traditional endurance athletes doing at the very highest level, and trying to kind of paint that same picture onto their life. And that's basically an apples and oranges comparison, even if they were going to be doing the same distance as the, elite professional Olympian or something like that, just because there's a lot of lifestyle variables that are going to be different from, say, a pro 5-kilometer racer versus someone who's, working a 9 to 5 and racing some 5-kilometer races on the weekends throughout the course of the year. But then when you add on that what I would consider an entirely different sport, certainly a different sport certainly a sport where the race day system that you're using the most is quite different. That's when it gets interesting to me, and where you can't really just extrapolate from like, this is what works for Olympic track and field athletes, therefore it must work for middle of the pack 100 milers or something like that. It's just like worlds apart, in my opinion. So I think sometimes like you get people past that, and then they start to kind of like get curious about it, and that can ignite it sometimes, is just kind of explaining the relative differences in, say, a 100-mile race and 5-kilometer race at the Olympic level.
Yeah, I think people got to get used to the idea of experimenting, like you said, because what works for one person isn't going to work for another. But when you dial down, you eventually figure out that, there is some sort of mechanism at work here. You just had to figure out which one was the one that was going to help you meet your goal.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no doubt.
So did you ever run any races when it was really cold? Any snowy races in Wisconsin or Minnesota or Canada or something?
Yeah, from an ultra marathon standpoint, I'm trying to think what the coldest race I did. I actually did a race last fall where at the start, I think it was 14 degrees wind chill. Wasn't snowy, thankfully, but there was a good wind and it was chilly at the start. But I haven't done any, I don't think, where it's just like there's a healthy amount of snow to plow through. There's one of the biggest 100 milers in North America is the Western States 100. And I was actually in that race on its coldest year on record. And there was, I think if I remember right, it was like 30 degrees up in the high country with like sleet and rain kind of blowing sideways. Right. So it added a really interesting variable on a course that can typically be at least a little chilly up in the high country before you drop down to the canyons, and it can get up into the triple digits. So that was kind of interesting, but it seems like I end up finding myself in events that are more on the extreme heat side of things than I do on the extreme cold side of things. And I'm not sure that that's necessarily intentional. It just happened to be the way things kind of played out for me. And part of it might just the Southwest has a pretty robust trail and ultra marathon events options. So if you do enough of them down in this way, you eventually find yourself in one where it's going to hit 100 plus degrees.
Sure. I keep waiting to hear that there's going to be a race from Phoenix to Los Angeles.
Yeah. I think there's maybe some planning going on of having one from kind of the Phoenix area up to the Flagstaff area, but Phoenix to Los Angeles would be an interesting one. There's plenty of desert between those two areas.
That's only 250 miles.
Yeah. Yeah. That's the interesting thing too, is when I entered the sport in North America, there was this big fascination around the 100-mile distance, and there certainly still is. But in the last few years, there's been a development on these 200-mile races where it's just kind of that mindset of, well, if 100 miles is a challenge, 200 must be a bigger one. And then you see people kind of getting excited about that. And, that kind of goes back to what we talked about earlier, where like, what's the draw to extreme endurance? And it tends to be like that very thing where like someone, maybe someone has done traditional endurance races, and then they decide one day, what, I wonder what it's like to do a 50-kilometer. And they go and they do a 50-kilometer race. And then, they meet someone who said, oh, well, 50 milers are pretty fun too. And then they start getting interested. Well, I wonder what it's like to run 50 miles. And they're just constantly kind of seeking out this unknown. And then before you know it, they're at 100 miles, and then they're like, well, what's next? And then there might not be a whole lot available beyond 100 miles for a lot of people. But then all of a sudden, like these 200 milers start to pop up and get some notoriety. And We've had some great race directors, or one in particular, Candace Bird, who's managed to put on some really, what I would consider, I mean, I haven't done them, but everyone I've talked to has been very complimentary about kind of how it's all organized and put together. And, she does 3 200-mile rate. Like it's 200 to 240 technically, I guess, or 238. And it's almost like this new culture within the culture, or this niche within a niche, I guess, is another way to look at it, of people thinking like, okay, well, I'm going to try this 200 miler now if I've already done a handful of 100-milers.
Wow. So this is going to lead me to a question which I've asked you about before, is feet and shoes. How the heck do feet last for 100 miles, and maybe you could tell us a little bit about the minimalist shoes. And, I've emailed you about shoes, because I've had foot problems my whole life since I was a little kid. When I was a little kid, I had flat feet. They put me in these special shoes that gave me helped me develop an arch, but then I wound up with a foot that has a giant arch, and the top of my foot is really high. And finally one day I ordered some of those Vibram 5 fingers, and I wore those, and I couldn't believe the difference, because my toes were always smashed together, which created one problem. The arch was always the wrong size, created another problem. I had problems with my heels, and then I've been wearing those 5 fingers for, I don't know, a couple of years now. And it's funny, because when I'm at the store or something, the women are always like, "Oh, your shoes are so cute. Where'd you get them?" And then the guys are like, "Hey, are those things really comfortable? I heard about those things, tell me about them." And I can't tell you how many conversations I have about these shoes and my giant feet, which oddly enough, the women are always like, "Oh, you have such nice looking feet." And I was kind of one of those strange sort of things. Well, if you only knew how many problems I had with them. And then I hear somebody like you, and of course the other marathon runners and ultra marathon runners, I think, man, I can't imagine feet lasting that long.
Yeah, it's an interesting topic to me. And, I have, I guess, maybe a slightly similar backstory to it, where I think sometimes people will see like, I'll do a race and I'll be wearing, say, a very what I would consider a minimalist shoe, or a really low profile shoe. Certainly a natural running shoe. I tend to like the lower profile natural running shoes, or things that are kind of skewing towards minimalist. And I think sometimes people see that like, well, maybe he's just a freak and his feet can handle way more than the average person. And I get a good laugh out of that, because historically my lower leg muscles and my lower legs have been my no pun intended, Achilles heel in my progression into the sport. Like when I was in college, I ended up doing 2 years of indoor and outdoor track and 3 years of cross country. And one of the reasons why it wasn't 4 years, or at least 3 on both of those, was because I had a whole lot of lower leg issues. I had, I think, a total of 20 to, depending on kind of how you count it, to 24 weeks worth of Achilles tendonitis issues early on. And, that ended up being kind of like the catalyst to, keeping me from being able to kind of build consistency and stuff within my training. So when I finished college and started to focus on building the overall volume in my training, I knew in the back of my mind that like I needed to make one of my weaknesses at least closer to one of my strengths. So I took on the challenge of making my lower legs stronger and more resilient. And I think that's where a lot of times people go awry, is they think of their feet as this kind of unchangeable scenario where like, oh, I have this issue going on, it's a reality for me to have to do this, or something like that. Whereas like if someone went into the weight room and say got under the bench press and could barely lift anything, they probably wouldn't think like, oh, this is my limit, this is the most I can do. They'd probably think, wow, I'm kind of weak here. If I keep coming here and doing this consistently over the years, maybe I can get stronger at it. So I think when people start switching their mindset of the way their feet are to that same mindset as how you would approach any type of strength program, you can kind of start to wrap your head around how people are able to get to the point where they can run 100 miles in a pair of shoes that weigh less than 4 ounces, or as I've seen a couple times, guys wearing no shoes. So
Yeah,
for me, it was like,
we have two guys. I don't know them, but there's two guys. They got to be older than me. They could be 10, 20 years older than me that run around my town that are barefoot. They run on the asphalt all the time. Everybody knows there's those guys. Actually, we thought it was one guy for a long time, but there's two of them. And they run around on the asphalt all the time. And they're always barefoot, year round. So.
Yeah, and I think like kind of what I was saying, like what ends up happening with a lot of folks is like they'll look at, say, like the minimalist movement or that approach, and they'll forget kind of where they're starting from versus where they want to be. And I think that's the biggest hiccup that the minimalist movement ran into a few years back. I don't know if you remember when like the Vibram Five Fingers kind of first came to market, and then it kind of coincided with that book Born to Run, where people started to kind of like get on board with, oh, our footwear is actually creating an issue versus a solution long term. And I think the problem with that was people had went from these big built up, sometimes supportive shoes down to like basically a slab of rubber on their foot. And they've over time, after that movement came through, people have associated that from like, oh, it's because we went from a big lift on our heel down to no lift, which isn't the case in my opinion. What they did is they went from a highly cushioned supportive shoe down to a zero cushion, zero supportive shoe, which basically asked those lower leg muscles to do a workload far greater than what they were ready for. And that led to a lot of lower leg injuries just because they, got out ahead of themselves a bit. When I did it, I knew I kind of wanted to get myself to be able to run in a super low profile minimalist shoe, but I knew that wasn't going to be the reality on day one. So I worked my way down. I did things in shoes that were kind of more natural, that had similar cushion to what I had been running in the past to kind of minimize the amount of changes I was making in my footwear. And over time, they got stronger in that position. And then I was able to reduce the cushion over time too. And, so what I tell folks is if you're interested in kind of getting your feet back in the proper position, get a natural pair of shoes that has a similar cushion to the shoes you're wearing currently. And first get yourself used to kind of just being in the right position. Get used to your body not being artificially propped forward, which is going to just cause like things like your posterior chain to kind of push out, which is going to cause your upper body to lean forward. You're going to create these awkward little kinks in your mechanics that are going to cause impact forces to move up into like your hips, your knees, your lower back, and areas that are commonly issues with runners. And then once you're used to you're back into that proper position, then you can start working on, if you want, going down to say something like a Vibram Five Finger or a minimalist type of shoe. And I think there's a lot to go into it. And like really the biggest hurdle for that movement is just getting people in the right natural running shoe at first, so they don't find themselves in a position that's too much too soon, so to speak.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And my only thought on that is I think a lot of people like me are in a position where you never really find a shoe that fits right.
Mm-hmm.
When the shoe never fits, it just creates problems.
Yeah. Well, what's really interesting? They did a study. I actually don't know if the study's out yet, but I should probably find out and be able to link it and stuff. But they did a study that looked at like injury risk on runners, and the number one variable that accounted for the least risk of injury was whether the person trying the shoe on identified that shoe as the most comfortable one that they were putting on. So that would be right along what you were saying. Like you find that shoe that is the most comfortable for you, most likely going to be the least injury risk out of any one that you would try on. I think sometimes the problem is there's so many options. It's like, how do you try them all on? Or,
right.
Hopefully you find a good specialty store that kind of has an idea, can help you narrow down that list to maybe 3, 4, or 5 different pairs. And then you can try on that kind of dialed in list and then pick the winner from that grouping. But it's a nice little feather in the cap for comfort is king, I guess. So whether that be a low profile minimalist shoe or like a natural highly cushioned shoe is going to maybe depend on where you're at the moment and kind of what your experience is when you first try that pair on.
That sounds like some solid advice right there. Well, we covered a lot today. I think we could keep going if we wanted to, but is there anything else you want to talk about before we wrap it up?
Not that I can think of. I think we did cover a few bases, and hopefully your audience will find it valuable. And if with the amount of stuff we touched on, sometimes people probably have some follow up questions, and if they do, they can certainly reach out to me, and I'd be happy to steer them in whatever direction I feel is what they're looking for.
Well, I appreciate that, and I'm sure they do too. I'm sure a lot of people get a lot out of this. So we covered so many topics. So now I really appreciate your time. I really appreciate you coming on.
Yeah,
So I'll definitely link whatever in the show notes, any
cool.
resources or whatever. You do coaching, I take it, for running.
Yeah, I do coaching. I've been doing a little more just kind of like consult call type stuff in the last year or so, mostly just because I've tended to branch out of the running kind of sphere a bit with my nutritional approach and just some of my kind of approaches to training and fitness as a whole. So the consult calls tend to be a little more welcoming to folks who are interested in my approach, but not necessarily interested in running an ultra marathon or running a race specifically as their primary target. So I do like a variety of different things along those worlds, but basically all that stuff can be found on my website at zachbitter.com.
I guess I should have mentioned that you're a co-host on Human Performance Outliers podcast. I just assume everybody already knows that, but maybe people didn't make the connection, especially if they're listening to the audio version. They may not realize you're the same person. So
yeah, no, that's been a fun venture that we're a little over a year into now. So me and Dr. Sean Baker do a podcast called Human Performance Outliers, and we dive into a variety of different stuff. Sean's unique in that he basically just ribeye steaks.
yeah.
I eat a lot of meat, and I would definitely consider myself like an animal-based diet. I'm not quite as 100% carnivore as Sean is, but it's definitely a foundation in my nutrition. But we do all sorts of we have all sorts of guests on, from doctors, professors, nutritionists, and folks who are very have dedicated a huge portion of their life to finding these answers to some of these questions, and for the most part, I think understand the individual component to any nutritional approach. So it's always cool to kind of learn from them. And it's not too rare that I'm the only non-doctor in the room when we do an interview. So
yeah, no, I've learned a lot from that podcast. Yeah, it's one of my favorite podcasts. I'll never miss it. So
I joke around that the reason that I get the editing duties for the podcast is because I'm the one who stands to learn the most. So I probably need to listen to it twice, where Sean can probably pick up after just one listen.
Yeah, he's made the comment. He doesn't really read much, and he does really seem to pick things up fast. I'm kind of jealous, because even like audiobooks, there's a few of them I've probably listened to 3 times or whatever to absorb it all. Because a lot of times there's a lot of content, but that's one of the great things about podcasts, is that people can listen to them over and over again. So they can break it down in pieces and sort of connect everything and make sense of it. So that's one of the reasons. Now, I myself am dyslexic, so I don't really read that any more than I have to, because it's challenging. And I really indulge in audiobooks and podcasts and YouTube especially. And that's one of the reasons why I do what I do. And I try and make them as friendly as possible. There's a lot of people with disabilities out there. A lot of people who are autistic, they have other disabilities on top of having the autism. And it's almost like, things like dyslexia and other learning disabilities are almost viewed as symptoms of the autism, because once you have one, you're more likely to have others. And that's why I think the media is so important, that getting that content out there and just being exposed. I mean, whether it's being exposed to things like ultra marathoning or all the varied topics that you guys have covered on Human Performance Outliers, I think it's kind of broadening people's horizons and letting people know, well, how far a human being can go in performance, or how varied just sourcing your animal-based diet can be. It really helps people understand how to make the changes, and how practical, or how much they can really leverage things. If you didn't have this sort of wide swath of exposure, it probably would be a much more daunting task to make changes, you know?
Hmm. Yeah, no, and I think with what you first said too, with like audiobooks and just audio content in general, I think just the amount of information you can get through just listening and not even have to read a single word is just leaps and bounds different from what I would have experienced as a student. And, it's always interesting when I was a teacher, if I was working with a student who was dyslexic, I think from the outside observer, it'd be easy to hand that child a book and have them start reading or trying to read and be like, okay, this student is just not as intelligent or not as smart as their peers. And I think the more we can get to the point where we look at that as like, it's not an intelligence issue, it's an uploading issue. It's like we're giving them one way to upload this information and they just happen to not be able to do that at a very fast rate. So it's like, now give them the information with a different upload system, like auditory versus written, and all of a sudden they can catch up no problem. In fact, sometimes they catch up really, really fast because they finally be given something that works for them, and they don't no longer feel like it's an uphill battle when everyone else is kind of coasting downhill. But yeah, super interesting. And then I think when you get into just like other things like focus and attention span, that's when you have the nutrition thing plays a huge component that I think, especially with our children in schools, we haven't really paid nearly enough attention to in terms of giving them, the best potential strategy to kind of manage things like that.
Yeah, I noticed the high fat diet, very particularly even now on carnivore, my focus and everything gets much better. I wish I'd had that back when I was going to school. It would have made a big difference. So
Yeah, no, it's one of those things where you're happy you found it eventually, but you always do wonder like, well, it would have been cool to have this for an extra decade.
yeah, really, for sure. All right. Well, be sure and email me any links you want. So I'll definitely put a URL for your website in the show notes. And thanks again for coming on. Maybe we do this again sometime down the road.
Yeah, no, thanks for having me on, Tom, and I'd be happy to come back on. It was a blast.
Okay. Thanks again.